Hello everybody, welcome to Build or Buy. Today we're going to be doing a BIOS update, so this should be interesting because we're going to go beyond just the BIOS update. We're going to be looking at purpose and intent. Now remember, this is on the Gigabyte TRX40 Designator motherboard. The current BIOS we are using is a beta BIOS. The next BIOS we're going to update to is also a beta BIOS. We're going to go overhead and take a look at this because this is somewhat of a deep dive because as it relates to purpose and intent. Usually and typically the purpose of updating the BIOS is so that you gain stability or you gain new features that were there but just weren't enabled. Well, that's a concern that we have with the current beta BIOSes that we've been through. Some of the problems that we've seen on the X399 chipset have been solved as it matured on the TRX40, especially on the Designator motherboard for that chipset. The problem we're still having is somewhat of resource allocation. And the question came up from one of you guys, and I've got some notes here I'm going to go through and try to talk about some of that, because as this relates to the BIOS, typically we've had in the past an errata document, which gave us a list of all those different things that have been fixed. We don't get that anymore. We don't even get a sentence. We get maybe 2 lines. One, it tells us about compatibility. It might tell us RAM compatibility. Okay, great. What else? Number 2 is the AGESA code. And a lot of people have been waiting for that next version of the AGESA code. One BIOS was put out. It was pulled because it was buggy. Everything I know about the current beta BIOS, I know from Rick from the Gigabyte forums. Because we don't have that errata document detailing and highlighting and outlining all those things that have been fixed, we have to go on somebody else's experience. So the other guinea pigs have had a chance to test it. The BIOS has been out about 30 days. But what I still am not certain about is some of the resource allocation. I'm going to show you what I know. I'll tell you what I understand. And my concern is, let's go overhead and I'll better explain it that way. Because there's some things we need to look at and we need to document before we update the BIOS. And we're going to only update the primary BIOS. I'll get more into that a little bit later. So as we go to purpose and as we go to intent, change one thing, changes everything. Overhead. Okay, as it relates, now right now I don't have my gloves on, but I'll have to when I go back inside. The machine is running. So as it relates to this machine, remember we have 2 16-lane slots and we have 2 8-lane slots. Okay, this first 8-lane slot is occupied. This second 8-lane slot is not occupied. What we're trying to determine are the resources on that slot. So what we're going to do is we have this 16-lane card in here, which is the, we'll just affectionately call it the Gigabyte quad card, which has 4 drives in there, 16 lanes, 4 lanes per drive. What we need to determine is how the BIOS has allocated resources for this last slot. Now this is an 8-lane slot, so there should be 8 lanes allocated to it. We're going to take this card, we're going to look at it in the BIOS where it sits right now, and we should see 4 drives, which we will. I'll show you what we're looking for. We're going to then take this card and put it in this slot. And when we go to this slot, we should only see 2 drives. But if we only see 1 drive, that means there's 4 lanes here. If we see 2 drives, that means we've got 4 lanes and 4 lanes. That's 8 lanes. If we don't see either one of the drives, then that means there's not enough lanes allocated for even one NVMe drive, and that's what we need to determine. Because I have a theory on why we can't put this Thunderbolt card in that slot, but I want to examine slot lane assignment first before I tell you what I think is actually going on. I will tell you this, there's another setting for this that should be in the BIOS for the Thunderbolt card that we don't have access to. And if that resource is hidden because it's hardwired to that slot, then there's no way that card can go in that slot. Now what we do know is when we tried to use 2 of these, we could not. I have a better understanding of why we cannot. It's just the way it's designed. It won't work. But if we cannot put this card in this slot, now remember, we had this card over here in this last slot, and system wouldn't boot, nothing. As soon as we plugged in the USB 2, that was the problem. When we unplugged the USB 2, system would boot and we were up and running. So I think the issue is about not just resource allocation, but another issue that I'll tell you about in just a couple of minutes. So let's verify this card. Now we're going to go to another screen. Right now we're in the BIOS, and as we go to System Info, I'm going to look at boot, and I'm going to see here that I've got 4 drives that are recognized, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now these 4 drives are all on the quad card. So what I want to do to verify that, I could go to Settings, look at the I/O ports, and on this second 16-lane slot, I have it set for bifurcation, not auto, but manually. What we want to remember is PCI Express 4.0 is supposed to be auto-recognized. If it is not, we set it manually because PCI Express 3.0 has to be manually set, be recognized for bifurcation. So I'm just going through making sure our ducks are in a row so that we're not trying to go what's going on. I'm building on the information that we're aware of so that if we get to a point where something doesn't work, I didn't have to go all the way back down to the bottom. I can go a step back or a step forward without having to take all the way down the ladder the very last step, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. So I'm documenting the process so we know what procedure we need to follow. So as we look at the BIOS and we see that this is configured accordingly, I'm now going to go back over and let's look at the easy mode. So let's press F2. That's one more thing I can look at in a different way. If you'll notice here, SATA, PCI Express, and M.2. Okay, PCI Express right here, the second slot right there, PCI Express. PCI Express by 16_2 is PCI Express 4.0 by 4 at 4.0 by 4. So that shows us that we see all 4 drives. I'm just looking at this every way that I know to make sure everything's good before I go to the other slot. So now the next thing we want to do is I'm going to power this down, drain the power, move the card, double check and see where that's at. Oh, and one thing I want to interject right quick. We're going to get a chance to take a look at the Sabrent drive. Another one of our subscribers has come forward and is going to let us take a look at that Sabrent drive. So I'm looking forward to that, and I wanted to tell you about it because I'm stoked. But getting back to this, as we explore this, let's look at our resources. We got to power down. My concern with those lane assignments, if we determine that we do have 8 PCI Express lanes, then the reason we can't move that Thunderbolt card over, again for that issue that's hidden, is the root port selector. If the root port selector is hardwired to this slot, and how you can find out that information, if you'll take a look at, like, say, one of the Asus boards with the X299 chipset, that will be an option where you'll have, say, 3 lanes, or excuse me, where you'll have, say, 3 slots, and you can pick which slot has the root port selector. And if you pick that slot, then you can assign resources on that slot specifically for a Thunderbolt 3 card. We don't have that option. Apparently Gigabyte, in their wisdom, has chosen to hide that information. If that's the case, that means it's hardwired for Thunderbolt 3 to be on that slot. They should identify that information. It ought to be written down somewhere. But that's my theory right now. So we're going to find out what lanes are assigned on this, and I want to know that before we update the BIOS, because when we update the BIOS, I expect anything custom we've done to get blown out, which brings up another point, because you have to be 2 steps ahead of what you're doing. Of the reasons to update a BIOS, for those of you that are doing RAID and you're using the BIOS, which is a hybrid RAID, you want to be sure that your RAID exists in 3 places. Why is that? RAID can fail. The only RAID I've had fail is a hybrid BIOS RAID. I've never had a hardware RAID card that we're not doing fail, and I've never had the, never say never, but I have yet to have a Windows RAID fail. But if you want a bootable RAID, and I think that's something we're going to have to do, because some people get hung up on the step about installing the drivers. So that's another video we're going to be doing with one of these M.2 cards, where we're going to do a hardware RAID, a bootable RAID, and I'll show you how those drivers go. It's like anything. Once you've done it, piece of cake, but if you've never done it before, it's like, what's going on? Why didn't somebody make this simple? And they shouldn't be so complicated. So let's pull this card out, see where our lane assignment's at. Now this is the card that came with the board. The other card that was the retail I put back in the box, I'm not using right now. We don't need it, but we have it for some testing. And I will say the other card that's made by, or the other 2 cards made by Asus, we're going to be looking at those later. Well, we got a whole bunch of other stuff we're trying to get to. For example, when we get through with this BIOS update, the next thing we need to do is we're going to be cloning this drive. So I'm going to talk to you about cloning, because since we're going to be looking at the new Sabrent 2 terabyte, that Sabrent 2 terabyte may be the new boot drive in this machine. So stand by for that. And oh, by the way, we've got a video card. We've yet to even put this RTX 2080 Ti through its paces, and we're going to upgrade that to an RTX 3080. So I've got some test results on that, and I've got some information I found out that kind of left me, well, puzzled, but it's all about the CUDA cores, but we're going to go through that, so we'll do an unboxing. Now this brings up an interesting point. Let me go over here and show you what I'm talking about. Because of the design of the motherboard, if you look here, and this is really, really crucial, the way this card sits, and it's a full card, for me to get it in this slot, I have to disconnect. Yeah, For what it's worth, folks, anything that sits above this heat sink right here, this large heat sink, anything that sits above that will not clear this card. Now, we're only doing this for testing, but it's good to know because right now we're working with two 8-lane slots. But what if you're working with two 16-lane slots? Because this brings up another point. Why would we want to put this Thunderbolt 3 card down here in this slot? Why? Okay, good question. This video card takes up 2 lanes. Excuse me, this video card takes up 2 slots. If we install, say, an RTX 3090 that takes up 3 slots, then that would cover where this Thunderbolt 3 card is at. If we wanted to put one 3-lane card in here, that would be fine, but this needs to sit down here. So we need to figure out what the lane assignment is. If, however, someone says, I want to put 2 of these in the machine, one sits here and one sits here, that'll still be fine. But then you no longer are able to use this card or this card. You would have 2 of these in here, 2 RTX 3090s. Then you would have a bridge that would cross, which would go 4 slots. 3 slots for one card and that. Now, if you use somebody else's RTX 3090 that takes up 2 slots instead of 3, you're in good shape. But if you're using the EVGA that takes up 3, that could be a problem. But if you change that one thing, changes everything, because if you can't use these 2 cards, there's no point in using this motherboard. I'm just saying. So I've got to unplug all this USB stuff so that I can get that card in. What a hassle. Apparently they never expected anybody to do this. And I'm also finding that if I do this, I've also got to undo the cables on the motherboard, which I am not going to do. That's not going to happen. So that's not going to work, because that's literally unplugging everything, even the I/O cables. That's where I draw the line. So I'm plugging those all back in, and we'll go to plan B. What's another way to figure out the lanes in that slot? I have another idea. So we're going to bag this up. I thought that was pretty genius. I never realized it wouldn't fit. You know, it's like they say, I know what I know, and what I don't know. I didn't know that wouldn't work. So what I need is a smaller card that I just happen to have. And this card is the Glotrends Sky card. It's one of my favorite little cards. And for those of you that with an X570 chipset, the Glotrends Sky card, this is the card you want to be using, because it takes an 8-lane slot, it puts 4 drives in, and it's going to work down here for our test. Let's go back overhead. So let's see how this is going to work. So all I'll have to do is unplug. Yep, I've got to unplug that USB 3 header. The cable there is just too big. And that's the one that goes to the motherboard. Now I've got another one here that goes to the back of a drive that works, that's thinner, but that doesn't solve the one that comes with the board. And the question is, will this fit with all these other cables down here? Yes, it will. That will sit in an 8-lane slot right down there. So we're going to secure that, and then we're going to go into the BIOS and see if we can see those drives. Remember, this is a bifurcated card, so the bifurcated card takes 8 lanes and does the switching. It's got a PLX chip built onto it. That's why they're so expensive. It's like buying a motherboard right there. So there's 4 drives in there. We're going to see if we can see those 4 drives. If we do, that means we see 8 lanes. Now, Glotrends makes 2 cards. One, they make the Glotrends Sky, which requires only 8 lanes. It'll also work in a 16-lane slot. But they also make another card, and which the name of escapes me at the moment. I've talked about it in other videos, that only works in a 16-lane slot. So for those with an X570 chipset, if you want to put 4 NVMe drives in a slot, that's the card you want, Glotrends Sky. One cable unplugged, which is USB 3. We'll just leave that hanging. I didn't have to undo any of the others. We're sitting right on top of them. We are in. We are secured. So we're going to plug our power back in. And then we will turn on the power supply, and we will energize. Now the Glotrends Sky card has LEDs on it, but they're on the inside. They don't show up from the back. And as soon as we hear it post, we'll go into the BIOS. Alrighty, we are in easy mode, and let's look at the PCIe. And it sees, look at that, PCI Express by 8 _2, PCI Express 3.0 by 8 at 3.0 by 8. I think that slot is still set for auto, but we're going to go over here, and where it says advanced mode, we're going to do that with F2. And let's go to boot, and we see those 4 drives. So that means we are getting all 8 lanes And that was one of the theories with this current BIOS, being that not all the PCI lanes were allocated. We've just proved they are. We are getting all those lanes. Those 8 lanes are allocated with this BIOS. So I think the point of this is, even though we know what was said on the Gigabyte forums, the facts are that there's 8 lanes with this particular BIOS, and I'll show you the BIOS we're using. Then we're going to update the BIOS, so we're not going to change anything with lane assignments with this. We know right now we've got lane assignment. I think the problem somebody was having beforehand is because they didn't understand it was the USB cable on there. And I think the problem, it's either got something to do with the SM bus communication, which is the cable that adds that communication that goes back to the special connection on the motherboard. And the whole issue is about a connection so that someone can't hack the Thunderbolt to get access to the machine to compromise it. That's really what this is all about. But for us that just want this stuff to work, we want Thunderbolt 3, which is native support. We also want the legacy support, which is Thunderbolt 1 and 2, which we're still going to go through and document the procedures. I know some of you have been aggravated that we haven't shown all that, but you only get so far in so much amount of time. Those audio interfaces are coming. We're getting there. We're getting there. But we had to do this first. You know, technology is amazing. When it works, it's great. When it don't, it's a pile of junk. So let's go back to the BIOS. So we got all 4 drives. It's PCI Express 3. I'm going to take a look, just a quick setting here at settings, I/O ports, and PCI Express by 8_2, and it is set to auto. I didn't have to set it manually, and it's working correctly. Okay, that's what I want to find out. So what do we know right now? We know that if you want to put something in that last 8-lane slot, man, that's tight. Even though this is an XL-ATX motherboard, this motherboard needs to be specifically 1/4 of an inch deeper. In other words, stick down 1/4 of an inch closer to the power supply. Because if you try to put anything in there beyond that 8-lane card, it's not going to fit. So that's something to think about. And that's a full 1-lane slot card because it has 2 drives on one side and 2 drives on the other side. Otherwise, it might be a problem. Now, the Thunderbolt 3 card could go in that slot. It's thin enough. But what we've just proven is that ain't going to work. I'm curious and I want to test it. But because of what we got into with the BSOD last time with the boot drive, I'm going to save trying that later, because when we get ready to run the quad card in RAID for a bootable RAID and do an operating system install, I will pull that boot drive. So when we do a video where we clone the drive and we're going to test this Sabrent drive, that's when we'll pull the boot drive. That'll be the time then to put in the quad card, and that'll be the time then to go through that process and take the Thunderbolt card and move it over, because we won't have to worry about the driver. There won't be a driver because the operating system's not there. So, you know, change one thing changes everything, but right now we're verifying that we can use that slot as is, but we cannot put the Thunderbolt 3 card in there, because my suspicion is still something to do with the root port selector. So that's kind of where I'm at. So as long as you go with the stock, which is the video card, the M.2 card, and you use that first 8-lane slot, that second 8-lane slot, that's up for conjecture. What can you put in it? I got a GloTrend Sky card in there, so, which means I could have, yeah, you hear where I'm coming from. The M.2 card with 16 lanes from Gigabyte or anybody else, including ASUS or ASRock or MSI if you can get your hands on one. And the GloTrend Sky card in that last slot. What else would you want to put in that slot? I will leave you with this before we get back to the BIOS. What else could go in that slot? Okay, this is PCI Express 4. My opinion of what's going to happen with USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4, even though they're different, is going to require PCI Express 4.0. And based on lane assignments that we have with Thunderbolt 3 requiring 4 lanes, and you don't get full speed because of the PCI Express 3.0 bus, PCI Express 4.0 is going to be required for Thunderbolt 4 and USB 4. We'll see how that plays out. It is what it is. I think now we can safely and freely update the BIOS. So let's look at the BIOS we've got, and then we'll see the BIOS we're going to go to. And what do we gain? 2 things. RAM compatibility Well, we've got that right now. We got 256 gigs of RAM in here. But the other thing we get is we update to the new AGESA code. What does that get you? You can do some research on that. But anyway, we'll have the latest AGESA code. So those are the two things we gain. Now, for those of you that have a RAID, you don't want to touch that BIOS unless you cloned, imaged, or backed up that RAID. And remember, RAID needs to exist in 3 places. Back to the BIOS. Okay, let's look at what version we are running. Let's go to Easy Mode F2, and it will tell us right up here. We are running on the TRX40 Designaire. We are running F4C. And of course, this is a 3970. And you can notice here we've got all the RAM slots filled. So let's get our stick out and update our BIOS. And we'll take a look right quick at the BIOS. Now you can see here we are at a beta BIOS F4C. The lowercase c denotes beta. You can see when that came out, there was one in between that was bad. We're going to F4I, also a beta BIOS. Shows the size is a little bit different, a little bit larger. This has been out about a month. And we're going to go over here and take a look, since there's no errata document, and tells us AMD update AGESA 1004. The previous BIOS updated the AGESA to 1003B and improved memory compatibility. Okay, we have the BIOS file. We're just going to copy them over. And we're going from F4C to F4I. So all we need is F4I. Let's see, that's F4L. So let's download F4I. Okay, F4I, we will now copy that into this folder on this little memory stick. And that now is ready for a BIOS. And the one that we're coming from, remember, is F4C, so we'll back it up as well. So I'll close these down. Let's reboot the computer, and we'll update the BIOS. So reboot. So we have 88 PCI Express lanes supplied by the CPU, and we have 72 PCI Express lanes that can be allocated by the motherboard based on design with the chipset. And it's interesting doing the math, seeing how those lanes are allocated. Okay, BIOS, here we go. We might do a video on that later. We had a question about that, I believe, from Matthew. It took me a couple of hours to put that together because I have to have that written down looking at me in front of me to see how the numbers work out, where you take 16 and 16, and you take 8 and 8. So you got 16, 32, going through that and figuring out where the lanes are. And by the way, there's 8 SATA ports on here. In my head there were 6, but if you're trying to figure out lanes, each SATA port is one PCI Express lane, so pretty easy to figure it out. Okay, back in the BIOS. All right, let's go to QFlash. We're going to do a save BIOS, and let's see how we see the disk. And it says right there SanDisk. That's what we want. So we're going to go to SanDisk. It's probably going to do it in the root. It sees both SanDisk drives. This is the one because I put a folder there for BIOS. And there's the backup BIOS. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a copy of the existing BIOS into this folder. It says file exists overwrite. No. So we've got to put a file name, which would be TRX40DE capital F4 lowercase k. We're going to say OK, and we are saving the BIOS. It's always a good idea to have a backup copy of your BIOS. Part of the reason I'm doing this is to show you. The other part of this reason is just to remind you to always have a copy of that BIOS. Now this was task, file, run, and done. We are done. So I'm going to say done. BIOS image saved. Now over here we'll do press escape for key or back, same thing. I'm going to go back to QFlash. Now we're going to update the BIOS. So I'll click on update. I'm going to go back to BIOS folder, and I've done the F4K. We're going to F4I. So I'm going to select the BIOS that I want to update to. And notice it highlighted down here in the bottom, TRX40DE.F4I. That looks like an L, but that's what it said. So we're going to go ahead with the update. Are you sure we want to update the BIOS? Well, yes, but we only want to update the primary BIOS, so let's say yes. Now, if you'll notice here, also update the backup BIOS. There's no check mark there. I don't want to touch the backup BIOS. Why is that? What if this BIOS is not sound, is not safe, and does not prove successful, nor does it accomplish what I need to and causes me problems? The easiest way to recover is from that backup BIOS. I could still get back to the BIOS and reflash it by downflashing it, but I'm going to leave that secondary BIOS alone, so I'm not going to put a mark in there where it says update it. So we're only going to update the primary BIOS. And I'm going to press start, and we're now updating the BIOS. I don't want to take the screen off of this because I want you to see the process and understand it. I've had some people say, once I build a machine, I never update the BIOS. Well, again, never say never. There may be something that you need or want, but you have to be prepared. If you have RAID configured with a hardware RAID, which is a hybrid RAID from the BIOS, you need to have a clone image or backup of whatever's in that RAID, because there's a 50-50 chance you could lose your RAID when you update the BIOS. Anyway, I had somebody with an ASUS motherboard that asked me, it wiped out their RAID, and I said, well, clone image or backup beforehand, you might be able to downgrade the BIOS and you might be able to recover your RAID, but chances are you're going to have to rebuild that RAID. So you just have to accept the fact, if you want a hardware hybrid BIOS RAID, be prepared that you may have to recover it. And someone says, well, how often should I do that? My question, okay, how much data can you afford to lose? How many days? And I reference that because I had a video edit one time. I lost 40 hours of editing. I said, that's not going to ever happen again. So I make sure data exists in more than one place. And I don't do RAID, but I will show you how to do RAID. I have done RAID in the past, didn't do what I want. And that was a very long time ago. And I can give you book and verse on the motherboard brand and model. It was kind of cool. Okay, reboot, and it's going to do a countdown. I don't remember it doing that before in the other BIOSes. And it will automatically reboot. So now what the system has done is it's powered down, it reconfigures. And part of the process is it tests the memory as it goes through this. So as it reconfigures and comes back up, it does a self-test, and we should be back in business. But you got to give it time. It's going to take time. How long? The TRX 40 boots slower than any machine I've seen in a long time. Probably since the 8088. That's how slow it is. You got to remember there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of technology. So once it gets back up, we'll go back into the BIOS. So for purpose and intent, we had a reason for doing everything we did. Turned out to be a non-issue. Now we know that. You know what I know. We're both seeing it at the same time. I don't do this in advance because we learn by doing. And I want you guys to see the process, what I go through to try to figure this out. So we got a BIOS in. We're going to go back into the BIOS. I heard it post, and I want to see what we've got. Okay, let's go back over. And we are in the full easy mode. So I'm going to take a look at what I know to be true, which is the drives. I see my two SATA drives, PCI Express. I see my secondary 8-lane slot still configured, still being used, and still fully functional. And I still see my two M.2 drives. Good. Now I'm going to go back into the BIOS for advanced mode. And RAM looks good. It shows the BIOS version. That says F4. That looks like F4L, supposedly F4i. Whatever it is, it's whatever the latest version is. Anyway, we got all our RAM configured. We got all our drives configured. So let's go back into advanced mode. Let's take a look at boot. I see my drives. Everybody's there. I'm going to go to settings. I'm going to go to I/O ports, if it'll let me. And I can see PCI Express. Yeah, it blew everything back to default. Nothing is set manually. Everything is set auto, which is the default. But default is working fine, which means bifurcation automatically for any slot that has that need. And that last slot, which would be the PCI Express by 8_2, bifurcation is set for auto. And that's pretty wild because PCI Express 3.0 is supposed to be set manually. It's set by auto and it works. I'm stoked. And if you notice here in the bottom left-hand corner, it says the same thing that I've highlighted up here at the top. So I'm stoked. I'll escape out of that, or I'll back out of that by clicking on settings. I don't think there was anything in miscellaneous we needed to set, although I expect it may have turned off. In fact, let me go back to settings, I/O ports, Thunderbolt, double click, press enter. That's still enabled. Okay, so we should still have our Thunderbolt working. So that automatically configures and recognizes now. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's great. USB configuration, all that is enabled. Just double checking. The SATA configuration shows the two removable USB drives as auto. Everything else is set for enabled. And back over to boot. Fast boot is disabled. CSM is enabled. We'll deal with that later when we get to RAID. And I have the option to boot from any one of these drives. Right now down to option number 12. So if we also put in the M.2 quad card in a 16-lane slot, we'd have 4 more drives. So we go from 12 boot options. Wow. Wow. 4 more added to that would be 16 boot options. I'm just saying. So, okay, we've been in the BIOS, and I think we've got everything verified with purpose and intent before, during, and after. This was all about updating the BIOS, but Change one thing changes everything. So of our purpose and intent, the next 3 videos you're going to be see coming up. One is going to be the new Sabrent 2nd generation PCI Express 4.0 drive. That may be our new boot drive. So we're going to be cloning our existing drive, which is in here, which is the Seagate drive. So we'll go from a Seagate FireCuda to a Sabrent 2nd generation. But I want to clone it. So we'll go through that. We're going to do a video on it. You're also going to see the test results on that drive. We're going to be doing an upgrade from the RTX 2080 Ti to the RTX 3080. I'm eager to see that. I'm stoked. Been wanting to get to that for a long time, but with all the questions, it's just, you know, I think you guys are amazing, and I appreciate all that. And then the third thing we're going to probably be doing will be, I'm eager to get to those Thunderbolt 3 audio interfaces. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. This is BuilderBot, and we are out.